Hello, I'm Alice Hutchinson, the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I am honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by author Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, puts it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So, with that, I welcome you. And please join us every Monday evening at this time as many of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other and with you in an effort to bring us together. If you missed our last week's episode with Susan Minot and Kristen Valdez Quaid and David Remnick, or any of the previous episodes of Write America, you can go to Birds Books Crowdcast channel and watch the recordings at any time. Tonight's episode is also being recorded, so if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch. Tonight, Birds Books hosts reading by and conversations with Helen Vendler and Lloyd Schwartz. I will return at the end and after their readings and discussion to bring your questions and comments to the authors. For those of you unfamiliar with Crowdcast, many of you have noticed the chat to the right of your screen. Please feel free to comment there throughout the evening. But if you have a question, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a tab that says Ask a Question, and that's where I will go to look for your questions and comments. The green link to this episode on Birds Books' website is also at the bottom of the page, and that's where you can purchase the author's books while supporting the bookstore and Write America. Our first speaker is Helen Vendler. Helen Vendler has written books on Emily Dickinson, W.B. Yeats, Wallace Stevens, John Keats, and Seamus Heaney. She has been a professor of English at Harvard since 1984. She is emeritus right now. From 1981 to 1984, she taught alternating semesters at Harvard and Boston universities. And in 1990, she was appointed the A. Kingsley Porter University professor, the first woman to hold this position. She has also taught at Cornell University, Swarthmore and Smith Colleges, and Boston University. Vendler received 7 honorary degrees from various universities, home and abroad. She's earned an A.B. in chemistry at Emmanuel College. She was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship for mathematics before earning her Ph.D. in English and American Literature from Harvard. She's also been a judge for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award in Poetry. In 2004, the National Endowment for the Humanities selected Vendler for the Jefferson Lecture, the federal government's highest honor for achievement in the humanities. Her lecture, The Ocean, the Bird, and the Scholar, used poems by Wallace Stevens to argue for the role of arts, as opposed to history and philosophy, in the study of humanities. Vendler delivered the 2000 Wharton Lecture on English Poetry. She is a member of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. Please welcome to the screen, Helen Vendler. Let me find you here, Helen. There you are.
Thank you, Alice. Thanks for having me. Now, I assume that I'm supposed to start. And what I want to start with, what I need to start with, is to read Keats's poem called To Autumn. It's short, it's only 33 lines, but that's what I'm going to be reading about. So let me just say a moment about this. 3 stanzas to the poem. The first is about all the fruit around a cottage and the nuts and the vegetables and everything they're raising. And the second stanza is about the middle of the harvest, when the harvest goddess, Autumn, has half finished her work, but we don't see her working. We see her taking time off from work. And then the last stanza is about when all the sights are gone of the vegetables and the reaping and the grain and the cider press and the apples. When that is all gone, what is left is the music of the creatures. And the central remark in the whole poem is to say at the ending of the visual part of the poem, where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? And then the poet turns to Autumn and says, think not of them, thou hast thy music too. And so the illustration of autumn music, when everything that can be seen and touched and tasted and felt has disappeared from the scene, is the last stanza. And it is that stanza that's particularly relevant to what Keats thought the social function of art was, which I'll be saying something about. Oh, here is to autumn. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbloomed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow, sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes, like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings, hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Ay, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking, as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. The part I want to read is aimed at illustrating the fact that poetry does not have to be mimetic or transcriptive. I have to find a page. Where is it? Here we go. Poetry does not have to be a description of the scene that is performing the philosophical work for the poem. It doesn't have to show war, for instance. It doesn't have to show somebody dying. It can meditate on these facts at a level above the transcription of facts and think about it, you might say, more metaphorically, more philosophically, more poetically. But in any case, what you see in this poem, which is about all of life, beginning, middle, and end, is nothing about anything but vegetation and birds. So that when you think of Keats's representation of the whole phenomenon of life, starting with the dawn of life and ending with the dusk of life, you have to translate the poem from its visual and tactile and taste remarks into something that analogizes itself to life. Everyone has seen this. I'm not saying anything new, but I just want to think about it in terms of what is art supposed to do for society. In the Ode on a Grecian Urn, Keats, as audience, opens his eyes to representational, if allegorical, art, and readmits his brain with all its perplexities and interrogations to aesthetic experience. In this fiction, one function of art is still, as in the case of Ode to a Nightingale, to offer the delight of an aesthetic and sensuous sort. This time a delight to the eye, this time in this autumn ode, rather than to the ear, like Nightingale. But no longer does art, with consolatory intent, ravish its audience away from the human scene. Instead, it draws its audience into the truthful representation of pictures carved in another medium, not visual, but verbal. The fiction of our spontaneous creation, or the fiction of artistic creation as a spontaneous outpouring to an invisible audience, which is the fiction of the Ode to a Nightingale, is jettisoned in favor of admitting the laborious nature of art as sculpted artifice. And Keats in the Ode on a Grecian Urn establishes the fact that appreciation need not be coincident with creation. He's appreciating the urn even though it was sculpted centuries ago. The freshness and perpetuity of art are insisted on, as is its social service to many generations, each of which brings its woe to the Grecian urn, each of which finds itself solaced by the urn, a friend to man, as Keats says. The social function of art, as Keats discovers here, is to remind its audience, by means of recognizable representative figures, of emotions and events common to all human life. In the Ode to Autumn, in his final understanding of the social function of art, Keats chooses nature and culture as the two poles of the symbolic system. He sees the work of the artist as the transformation of nature, grapes, apples, wheat, into culture, the transmutation of the teeming fields into garnered grain, the gleaning of the natural into books, as his earlier poem had described, earlier sonnet. Since civilization itself arose from man's dominion over nature, the processing of nature by agriculture became the symbol in Greece of the most sacred mysteries. Keats's Autumn Ode takes as its allegory for art the making of nature into nurture. The artist with reaping hook, cleaning basket, and cider press denudes nature, we may say, but creates food. We cannot, so to speak, drink apples or eat wheat. We can only consume processed nature, apple juice and grain. Since the artist is his own teeming field of nature, art in this allegory is a process of self-immolation. As life is processed into art by the gleaning pen or threshing flail, the artist's own life substance disappears as the goddess of autumn disappears. And where wheat was, only a stubble plain can be seen, but over the plain there rises a song. Song is produced by the steady rhythm of nature transmuted by self-sacrifice into culture. Art does not mimetically represent nature any more than cider mimetically represents apples. But without apples, there would be no cider. Without life, there would be no hieroglyphs of life. In this way, Keats insists again on the radically non-mimetic nature of art when it is symbolic, but yet argues for its intelligible relation to life in its representative symbolic order and for its constitutive power in that order. Other poets, I think now of Czesław Miłosz and Seamus Heaney, have attended more directly to social criticisms or social critiques in art. In Miłosz, in the beautiful poem, The Poor Poet, when the poet, wanting to write a tragedy, is furious that his art keeps turning out beautiful things, as like the flower of Joseph's rod. But Heaney is more willing to approach the nature of art mimetically, but what he takes up as his example is the task that Chekhov, who was a medical doctor, took on when he was bidden by the government to go to the Japanese island of Sakhalin, which was a convict island, and describe the conditions among the convicts, the guards, and the prison itself. And when he gets there, he sacrifices his life of luxury in coming to the prison island, smashes a bottle of brandy that his friends had given him when he was leaving Moscow. And when he smashes it, it rang, says Heaney, it rang as clearly as the convict's chains that haunted him. In the months to come, it rang on like the burden of his freedom to die for the right tone, not tract, not thesis, and walk away from floggings, so that the tragedy is finally absorbed into the tone, he can walk away from flocks and go home, but it will haunt him forever. And the tone he has to find is neither the religious exhortation of a tract, nor the philosophical contemplation of a thesis. It has to be something more human than either a tract or a thesis, and that brings up the problem of how it is represented in the poem to carry the human freight rather than just a freight of argument. And that's all I have to say tonight.
Thank you, Helen. Our next speaker is Lloyd Schwartz. Lloyd Schwartz is the Frederick S. Troy Professor of English Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, the longtime classical music critic for NPR's Fresh Air, scholar and editor for the works of Elizabeth Bishop, and the current Poet Laureate of Somerville, Massachusetts. Among his awards are NEA and Guggenheim Foundation fellowships for his poetry and a Pulitzer Prize for criticism. His poems have been selected for the Pushcart Prize, the Best American Poetry, the Best of the Best American Poetry. His most recent poetry collections are Little Kisses in 2017 and Who's on First, new and selected poems published in 2021. Please welcome to the screen, Lloyd Schwartz. Let me find you here, Lloyd. Here we go.
Hi, Alice. Thank you. And let me just begin by saying what an honor it is to be on this program with Helen, and how profound what you had to say about how profound I thought what you said about what is really my favorite poem in the English language, Keats's To Autumn. Thanks to Roger Rosenblatt for starting this series, and to Leslie Atkins for helping to keep it going. On the website for Write America, it mentions that the series is a series in which writers read and discuss their works, intimating how the deep divisions in the country may be healed by the quiet power of art. And I was thinking about art as something that heals. And I want to go back, and I'm going to start with a short piece of prose that was, it was a Fresh Air review from 1991, from January 1991, just after the beginning of the Gulf War. And this is what I wrote, and it's really about art and music, and how important that is in time of a cultural crisis. I've been very moved by the way musicians in Boston have responded to the war. The cast of the Peter Sellers production of The Marriage of Figaro had a statement in the program about how the opera's war between the sexes, quote, holds a small mirror to all the brutality, bullying, greed, and self-righteousness of the larger world. They say Mozart tells us that although it seems impossible to say no to war, peace is within our reach. At the annual Mozart birthday and AIDS benefit concert at Emmanuel Church in Boston, pianist Russell Sherman, speaking against the war, said he found in music a source of balance and reason we need to hear. In a time of crisis, great art becomes more, not less important. The night after the first Scud missile hit Israel, I wasn't much in the mood for music. But one of my favorite groups, the Cantata Singers, was doing one of my favorite pieces, Arnold Schoenberg's choral work, Friede auf Erden, Peace on Earth. So I went. Conductor David Hoos led an unusually clear and unusually impassioned performance. There was a warm round of applause. then an amazing thing happened. The applause wouldn't die down. The audience began to stand, one by one. There were handkerchiefs in many hands. It's as if it were slowly dawning on us what this sublime spiritual music really meant, and how much we all needed to be there together, listening to it. Then, without even looking at us, Hoos returned to the stage and signaled the chorus to sing it again. This time, we all understood from the beginning. The cantata singers' concert had been planned long before the war broke out, but it was clear that in some deep way, the music was responding to the world crisis, that making and listening to music was a way of responding to world crisis. 2 days later, there was a benefit concert by the Boston Philharmonic, a remarkable community orchestra conducted by Benjamin Zander. The special guests were cellist Yo-Yo Ma and pop star Bobby McFerrin. In one duet, Yo-Yo Ma played the Ave Maria, while Bobby McFerrin sang in the sweetest counterpoint the first prelude from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. This heavenly music and music making is not just consoling. I think it makes us feel a little less helpless. We can say to ourselves, if the human spirit is capable of such sweetness and generosity, such harmony, there's still a chance it might survive. And I would like to read 2 poems about music. The first one is shorter than the second one, and it's called The Conductor. Breezing easily between exotic chinoiserie and hometown hoedown, whisking lightly between woodwind delicacy and jazzy trombone, he must have the widest and oddest repertoire of gestures, which allows him a stylistic and dynamic range unusual even among today's most highly regarded conductors. The way he slipped from the grandiose opening allegro maestoso to the suddenly jaunty allegretto made me laugh out loud, though his small, complex gesticulations can diminish and even undermine the passages where the melodic lines ought to soar. He's all dippy knees, flappy elbows, and floppy wrists. Not Bernstein's exaggerated self-immolation, but little complicated pantomimes, steering a car down a winding road, patting down a mud pie, robbing eggs from a bird's nest and carrying them carefully away, flinging tinsel on a Christmas tree. As a baseball umpire, he could declare a runner simultaneously safe and out at home plate. He threw himself into the music, and very nearly into the first violin section, with a kind of reckless abandon that comes only with complete confidence and authority. Not so much confidence in himself and authority over his players, but confidence in his players and authority over his material. These glittering performances, more dazzle than warmth, more brilliance than magic, sophistication without innocence. Does the music ever hold surprises, even for himself, or terrors? How much would we love him if it did? And my last reading is a longer poem, and it's brand new. I have never read it in public before, so I'm still figuring out how to do that. It's called Arthur Schnabel and Joseph Szigeti Play Mozart at the Frick Collection, April 4th, 1948. Two of the greatest musicians who ever lived couldn't record together. They worked for competing companies, but they admired each other and occasionally played together in public. One concert took place at the Frick Collection, the most refined museum in New York. Just outside the concert room hang some of the masterpieces of Western art: Bellini's St. Francis, Rembrandt's self-portrait, Titian's a Velázquez, 3 Vermeers. It seems right. That concert must have been broadcast on the radio. Someone must have recorded it. I didn't know it existed until a friend surprised me with a copy for my birthday, one of my most cherished gifts. The greatest pianist and the greatest violinist of the century. I had never heard them perform together. I couldn't imagine it. Schnabel's uncanny delicacy, his sense of tragedy, a trill that suddenly sees into the abyss. Szigeti's visceral touch, his heartbreaking soulfulness, his speaking inflections. Could they really play together? If anything, they are more intimately responsive to each other's odd individual voice, than almost any other musical collaborators I've ever heard. Ella and Louis, her heavenly sweetness, his earthy growl. More immediately, intuitively responsive to each other than almost any pair of musicians I've ever heard. Mozart's Sonata in E-flat, K481 as it's usually referred to, one of the wondrous later pieces he wrote in Vienna. He was nearly 30. In less than 6 years, he'd be dead. He was one of the inventors, one of the masters of the kind of music making in which the players are equal partners, not just a soloist with an accompanist. Collaborators, conspirators. In K481, the players are equal, not identical, but equal, a partnership in which both partners can maintain their own personality, their own individuality. Not identical, but equal. Schnabel begins with an enunciation, 3 firm notes. Then Szigeti puts the period on Schnabel's brief sentence. Or is it an exclamation point? Then Schnabel relaxes, almost whistling a little tune. Szigeti gives him room. Szigeti softens too. Their first moment of equal tenderness, not exactly toward each other, but a sudden, easy acceptance of the possibility of goodness, of kindness in the world. They're mutually content, in accord. They share their accord. In the slow movement, Schnabel is singing a lullaby. Or is it a love duet? Lovers parting? And Szigeti is humming along. Then suddenly it's the violin singing, a quiet lament, Szigeti trying to hide at least some part of his grief, while Schnabel gently insists, on getting past this. When the opening melody returns, Schnabel incorporates Szigeti's lament, and Szigeti extends his. Near the end of the movement, the violin suddenly, urgently leaps into another register, another world, as if staying on the earth were just too hard. In fact, intolerable. Schnabel's piano flutters in agitation, then resigns itself to allow Szigeti to pour his heart out. Schnabel lets him, waiting for Szigeti to return to the ground, which he finally, though with some apparent reluctance, does. And once again, they are both part of the same world, where crying out against grief and accepting it are inseparable. Can there be a happy ending? Szigeti, maybe reluctantly, seems finally to have passed through lament into something close to joy, bringing Schnabel along with him. Or is this joy exactly where Schnabel was heading from the very beginning? They are soon not just resigned, but happy, equally, if not identically happy, increasingly exuberant, playful, teasing, increasingly a couple. Is that a tear about to fall? Whose? But no, they continue their game. Yes, they say. Yes, we're all right. It's all right. Mozart says it's all right. Mozart says yes. In a concert at the Frick Collection in 1948, Arthur Schnabel and Joseph Szigeti played Mozart's Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. I'm so happy to have heard you read that second one, which I read for the first time when you sent it to me.
Yeah,
And it has so many, what shall I say, so many planes. Sometimes it's the two instrumentalists who are doing whatever is happening. Sometimes it's the two instruments that are doing whatever is happening. Sometimes it's the minds of the two instrumentalists as they lean into one or the other's performance and interpretation. And I think its larger resonance in which it's distinguishing equality from identity, or saying that one has to think about them differently and that we all want both, that they're not in conflict, they're in harmony when everything is working well. But this is also a beautiful poem about friendship, the way a friendship goes back and forth between people, kind of antiphonal chorus as they're singing each their part and exchanging feelings and exchanging technique, exchanging manner, exchanging import. It is a wonderful poem. And I'm so happy to have seen it.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, you're practically the first person to have seen it.
Good.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot.
Well, it has a lot of drama to it too. I mean, it's a plot that is unfolding as you go along, examining the plot and what there is to be said about the plot as it varies from this moment to that moment to the next moment. And in that sense, it's one of the most dramatic lyrics, I think, that it's possible to write. And, it keeps happening. It's new things each line.
Oh, thank you. Wow.
It's true. It's true.
I think I'm going to turn off the television, the computer now.
But I also like the conductor. I have to say that but I like it less than the new poem. I think the conductor is a more conventional poem, perhaps, than the new poem. And though there's a place for each in the world, needless to say, I also wanted to say there's a place for unhappy music too, that is not consolatory.
Right.
Where would you go for music if you were enraged? Maybe you go to the Marseillaise or something, but you want something to reflect back the mood that you happen to be in, not simply a mood of longing where you want to be consoled, but also a mood of irritability, rage, or something where you want to be mirrored.
Or terrible distress.
Yes.
Or depression even. And music goes there too. I think with Mozart, it's really a little different, and maybe it's why Mozart is my favorite composer, because even the most tragic elements in Mozart, there's almost always a happy ending, and it's as if he's just that somehow the life force takes over at the very end, even after the most tragic music.
Well, the fact that you can say that shows why you got the Pulitzer for criticism. I mean, you render things. I was thinking that about the conductor too. There's a mixture of humor and seriousness in both of these poems, where you kind of believe what is being witnessed because it has its own modulation, from the serious or the earnest to the quip or the throwaway line or whatever it might be. So
I will confess that the conductor poem actually started as a review.
Oh, did it?
And it was a review I wrote for the Phoenix. It was a Boston Symphony concert. I'm not going to say who the conductor was. It wasn't a local.
You have to. No, you're not going to tell us.
Do? Okay. Well, it was Charles Dutoit.
Oh.
Who was very fussy about all of his gestures. He was a very good conductor, but then not a great conductor. And but it started as a review, and I thought, looking at it again for just by chance, I thought, well, this could be a poem. I mean, it's not exactly as I wrote it the first time, but that's where it started.
Isn't that funny?
So
well, yes, it starts off as something mimetic and turns into something philosophical. It always has to go to the other plane.
But
let me say, just if I can for a moment, to all my friends out there, I just saw your names when I saw the list of visitors to the program. Hello, everybody, from wherever you're saying hello from. I'm glad to see the names.
Me too. Me too. I can see some of them now, but not all of them. But Helen, To Autumn, I think it's just one of the most extraordinary pieces of writing that anyone has ever written in English, and a great maybe Keats's. I don't know. Do you think it's Keats's greatest poem, or can we not?
It's in a duel with the Introduction to the Fall of Hyperion, which is the great last philosophical statement.
Yeah.
And there's such different kinds of poems, you really can't compare them.
Right.
But the thing about To Autumn is that every single word counts for something within the interpretation. He really has filled all fruit with ripeness to the core. There's not a layer that isn't ripe. And it's amazing.
It is amazing. And I think both I don't know, there's something heartbreaking about that poem, because everything is coming to an end, and yet everything isn't coming to an end. And there's the poem, and how extraordinary that is, and how just unbelievably beautiful it is. I mean, I mean, even for Keats, who wrote all these beautiful poems, it's just phenomenal. And I love what you write about it, because I mean, it's very illuminating the way. I mean, we know that the ode on a Grecian urn and the Ode to a Nightingale are really about poetry. They're about art. And this is, it's more of a secret that this poem is about art. I mean, people regard it as, as a nature poem, which of course it is, but it's not just. And you really are so eloquent about bringing that kind of secret element of the poem to our attention and to the surface.
Well, thank you.
I'm
I do really think that it takes years to get through the sense that you have of each word. I mean, certainly the first time I read it, I was a girl. I thought it was a nice poem, of course, but I didn't understand. The thing that struck me very last about the poem was that I often think about the tiny words and the functions they have in poems. And when he's talking about hearing the songs, this song is coming from there, this song is coming from there, from Among the River Sallows or from Hilly Bourne. And then the very last song, and gathering swallows twitter. And it's not from the skies, it's in, which means he has raised his glance up. So that having drawn the plain boundaries of the farm in flat dimensions, I mean, there's the bourne and there's the willows and whatnot, but then the looking up at the end is such a surprise.
Oh, I've never really taken that into account before.
Well,
But you're absolutely
it hardly is emphasized at all.
it just
It just
goes
happens.
by, and
Yes.
but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
And he could have said downward to darkness on extended wings, but he didn't.
Right.
He
He
said
didn't.
in the skies.
No, right. Well, we like downward to darkness on extended wings
We
too.
like that too, we do. But it shows you by contrast, and I think it was Stevens who made me see that it was not downward to darkness, but rather upwards to light, if you look to the skies, even though it's dusk.
Yeah.
But no, it's an incomparable poem, and I hope everybody rereads it, if only to see it once more.
Me too. One of my favorite things about To Autumn is that all of those, at least the three earlier famous Keats odes, the Nightingale and Grecian Urn and the Ode on Melancholy, those are all 10-line stanzas.
Mhm.
And the Ode to Autumn To Autumn is an 11-line stanza. And there's a way in which the abundance that Keats is writing about is even reflected in the form of the poem.
Mhm.
And then, of course, it also comes to an end. You think warm days will never cease,
Mhm.
but
The
they
poor
will.
bees. Yes.
Yeah, right. But they will. And even with that extra line in the stanza, you get both the abundance, the richness, and also, in some ways, it's even more poignant that it comes to an end.
And the extra line makes a reluctance to end. I mean, it doesn't
Yeah.
hurry on to its own end to be 10
Exactly.
lines like the others, but it holds off and sort of stops for a moment, pauses for a moment. And I
Yes.
think that has to do with the reluctance of Autumn herself to cut down the grain and whatnot. She stops in the middle of her tasks, in the middle of the threshing or the gleaning.
Yeah.
You never see her actively gleaning or actively threshing or actively cutting down the wheat. Instead, she spares. It's like an execution. That's why the idea of execution
Right.
so strongly comes in, that she spares the next swath. She's saying, not just yet, for that poor flower that's twined in with the wheat and is going to be cut.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a remarkable
It's
thing to think of, showing the harvester in reluctance rather than in harvesting.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just well, he was a unusual sort. And what would he have been had he lived longer?
Had he lived even 3 more years,
Yes.
I mean, it was just, I mean,
Well, it's like Mozart, again, the comparison you made of, what would Mozart have been saying yes to the same degree if he had lived to be 60? Who
right.
knows?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you wonder what Keats would have been, our Shakespeare, of course, had he lived. But I think he was wrong in thinking he wanted to write plays. I mean, he wanted to be like Shakespeare. I think that was a mistake.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I think he was I may be misremembering this, but I think his doctor or his doctors told him not to write poetry in his last years because it excited him too much.
Mhm.
And so he turned to this play, which
Yeah.
I suspect didn't excite him
No.
nearly as much as his poetry did.
But what age were you when you started to write poetry?
Well,
Speaking of these
um,
young poets and
yeah,
musicians.
well, I was a senior in high school, and I had a wonderful teacher. My first really great teacher was my senior year high school English teacher. His name was Alan Canfer, and he reminded me of Groucho Marx. And his son, Stephen Canfer, was Groucho's biographer. So I think there's some little
Mhm.
connection in there. And he was a teacher. He was one of those great teachers who would do anything to make these high school kids love poetry. So we read Macbeth, we read Ode on a Grecian Urn, and we read Fire and Ice, Frost's
Mhm.
Fire and Ice. And I thought, I never had any interest in poetry before. And suddenly it was something I just totally fell in love with. And I wanted to write poetry too. And I
Mhm.
kind of wrote a stupid little jingle in which I was kind of, if I think back now, I was playing with the rhymes because I could never write like Keats or Frost. So I had to do something kind of playful of my own.
Mhm.
And and then and that was the poem I wrote in high school. And then when I started college, I had another great teacher, Mary Doyle Curran, um, and uh, and she did some Keats in
Mhm.
her freshman literature class, and I signed up for the literary magazine to work on the literary magazine. So I got very serious about poetry
Mhm.
in my freshman year.
That's
And
a wonderful moment of transition if you're going into the last year of high school and then the first of college.
totally. And I was really because I grew up in New York City, I was really quite young when I was 16 when I graduated from high school. It was a social catastrophe. But
Yes.
but but I was just ready to fall in love with poetry if I had the right teacher, and I
Yes.
did.
I
And I
think
did.
that happens to an awful lot of writers, that it is a teacher who shows them what poetry can be by contrast to the sort of awful poems they were made to read in elementary school.
Exactly. When did you get really interested in
Well, my
poetry?
mother used to recite poetry to us. I mean, she had memorized a lot of poetry so that I had heard it. And
Right.
then, of course, I wanted to imitate it myself and wrote dreadful poems between the ages of 6 and 15. And then finally, when I was 15, like you, I wrote
Right.
my first real poems, you might say. And I went on writing them for 10 years until I was 26 and found my true vocation in writing critical prose rather than poetry.
Yeah.
I didn't know what was wrong with my poems. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I was doing them as faultlessly as I could. So I couldn't
Yeah.
figure it out. And then one day I read a sentence, much later, I read a sentence in Coleridge about that something wasn't the person from Pollock, but something had interrupted, quote unquote, that perpetual reverie in which I live. And I thought, I don't live in a perpetual reverie. I don't have another story going on all the time behind my forehead as while I'm living. I just didn't ever have that. So I knew that I didn't have a creative imagination, because if you have a creative imagination, you always have a double life, which I finally realized, in which you are always making something original while you're doing your ordinary life, but there's a life that's going on inside. And I just didn't have that dual life.
Yeah.
So I ended up not being a poet, but teaching poetry and enjoying
and
bringing
loving
students to it. Yeah.
and loving poetry and conveying that love for poetry. And
Well, as you do for music and all your criticism. I mean, it's just, since we're both critics, we both have the same aim to that degree.
yeah. Well,
It's a bridge to the other set of people.
yeah. And I certainly get this from you, and I hope people get this from me too when I write about music, that this stuff that we write about is really extraordinary, and that we, among other things, we want to share it.
Well, yes, when Milton said he hoped to write something that posterity would not willingly let die. And he was right, of course, but
Right.
I'm afraid of what is dying these days when poetry has not the position in education that it used to have. And
Right. Yeah.
it's just not enough being taught. Hello, Mary.
I agree.
Here we are. We have some questions. We have a couple of questions from the audience that I thought
Yeah.
bore paying attention to. So the first question is for Lloyd, and it's from DeWitt Henry. I wonder if you remember the effect of Mary Lavin reading her story, The Mother, years ago to an audience that expected to hear Elizabeth Bishop, but had just been informed about her death. That always stands in my mind like a performance of Mozart in the London subway during the Blitz.
Yes, I do. I remember that very well. I will never forget that evening. It was the night after Elizabeth died, and there was she and Mary Lavin was coming in from Ireland, and Elizabeth was coming in to Cambridge from Boston, and it was a benefit for Plowshares magazine, which DeWitt happens to be the founding editor of. And we couldn't cancel the reading. I mean, if it were just Elizabeth, we would have canceled the reading. But we couldn't, because someone had just flown in from Ireland to give this reading. And it was a really wonderful reading on her part. And I think there were 5 of us at the last minute. I mean, the night before, 5 of us were contacted and were asked to, would you each pick 3 poems by Elizabeth Bishop to read to this audience?
Mm.
It was Robert Pinsky, me, oh gosh, Keats biographer, who taught at NYU.
NYU.
I
Was it
just
Keats?
can't.
Maybe our audience can put it in the chat if they think of it first.
Keats biographer. She wrote kind of.
You mean Eileen Ward? Oh, yes,
Eileen Ward,
of course. Yes.
And she was one of the readers. And what was fascinating, and this says more about Elizabeth Bishop than about Mary Lavin, who was just a wonderful reader and a wonderful presence. 5 people each took 3 poems by Elizabeth Bishop to read, and no one overlapped.
Oh,
No
my goodness.
2 people picked any of the same poems. And that was kind of extraordinary as well.
That happened when Philip Larkin died, too. I mean, we had a reading in memory of Philip Larkin, and I said to John Clive, who was arranging it, what will happen if we overlap? And he said, well, doesn't matter. We can always hear it twice. But there was no overlap. Each person had done a kind of psychic,
Extraordinary.
X-ray of the self, and then each person gave the poem that was most like themselves, which was an interesting evening.
Yeah.
Well, the second part. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I just want to
Go ahead.
sneak in that, Helen, your essay on Elizabeth Bishop is still my favorite piece of prose written about Elizabeth Bishop.
Oh, that's too kind of you. Thank you.
I
think
go back.
Many people have written very well about her, as you know, I mean, including yourself.
Yes, and increasingly, and I think too. But that essay on domestication, and the otherworldly is really, I think it's a great essay and a great.
I was so glad to have her poems. And I once, after Crusoe in England, I said she had written a classic poem that would never die. And she said, "Do you think so?" I was modest.
Nell Painter asked both of you, do you both read Keats differently now that the climate and environmental crisis are so much on our minds?
No.
Well, that was nice and fast.
I mean, to say, courtesy to Janelle, one of the ways people come to poetry, I mean, there's so many ways that people come to it, and some people come to it with a very intense theme in their life at that moment. And I think what George Graham has done with the whole ecology question, which is very intense because it was on her mind before it became in the public mind so much. Right. But I always came to poetry from poetry, not from the external world.
Right.
So I read poet X because I've read poet Y, not because I'm concerned with somebody having died or somebody having blown up a city, or it's just not like that.
Yeah.
I don't know what you feel.
No, absolutely the same. Absolutely the same. And of course, one can extend what one reads to things that are of interest to us in other fields and what's going on in the world. But it doesn't change my access to the poems. And I don't really like to read the poems that I love and force them to have some kind of contemporary relevance. I think they are relevant enough on their own.
I need to start to begin to wind down our time, and it's breaking my heart because I could listen to you discuss all night long. So I am going to ask two questions. The first is, what advice would you give to someone who is writing their first book? And this isn't homework. You don't have to answer it, but I just thought here's your chance to give some advice.
Well, my advice would be to write, as I wrote my dissertation, between midnight and 4 a.m, because everything of the day is done and the telephone isn't going to ring and one of the students is not going to be coming to visit or something. And so it was just when that piece descended that it made me so happy to be able just to think about nothing else for 4 hours straight. And I always found that to be true. I mean, I had to write when the house was quiet.
Do you still find that to be true?
Yes, unfortunately. I mean, it got, I still stay up all night sometimes. My son tells me I'm too old to be pulling all-nighters, but I can't help it if I get going sometimes.
I know. I can't help it either. I know.
So what's your advice to a new writer?
Oh, gosh. If it's poetry, I really want them. If someone is writing a poetry thesis, I just want them to read great poetry while they're working on their own poetry. And and read each other's poetry, read as much poetry as possible, but really also to read what has been a tradition of really great poetry. And that's what I'm afraid is getting lost in the academic world these days.
Well, let me just warm your little hearts right here, because our largest events at the store are poetry evenings. I've just had a 4-part poetry series, and the last part of the series on this Sunday is Western Connecticut State University. One of the professors is bringing over their undergrads and their grads, and they're going to spend 2 hours reading poetry in the store. So it is wildly popular here, and we're seeing an uptick in poetry in the last 8 months. So I really want to let you know that poetry, there's a light on poetry now that there hasn't been for a while. So I needed to fortify you a little bit because people are
Great.
buying it.
Good.
All right.
Well, thank you, Alice. That's good to hear.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
I just wanted you to know. I'm going to round out the hour with asking you what are you reading? What's on your nightstand?
Lloyd, what are
good.
you reading?
Oh my goodness. I just started reading a new book about Diaghilev, which I'm going to be reviewing somewhere in the next couple of months, and it's been very interesting. I have been reading an art book. I went down to New York to see the Medici exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, and I thought it was extraordinary. And there's a really good catalog for that. You know, I read the poems my friends write, and
That's
but
fine.
I don't
It wasn't designed to be homework. It was just let's
Yeah.
share what we're all reading at the moment. And I'm not sure whether Helen, are you still with us? Oh no, we lost Helen.
Oh no.
Let me see if we can
I
get her
wanna-
back just for the
I wanna-
last couple minutes.
I want to know what Helen
I
is.
want to know what she's reading. So if she can come back, I really do want to get the chance at least to say goodnight. But I will say that both of you have really brought us something very special and unusual. I mean, I find myself wanting to run out. Oh, Helen, you made it. There you are. I want to find out what you're reading.
I've been reading, even though I've never studied German, and I don't read German. There's a poet named Urs Grünbein, who is now a famous poet in Germany, who has just written the most extraordinary book. His first collection that was brought out in English was called Ashes for Breakfast. It was translated by Michael Hoffman. But the new book is called Porcelain in English, Porzellan in German. And it's about the carpet bombing of Dresden by American and English bombers. That Kurt
I've heard of this book. I've heard of this book, yes.
And it's 50 poems, all the same, conventional verse in the sense it's unconventional in every way, but it's rhymed and it has 10 lines. Each poem has 50 poems. Each one has 10 lines, and each one rhymes in two quatrains and a couplet, as though it was a Shakespeare sonnet missing the first quatrain. And they're extraordinary poems in terms of their hostility to some German views. He says, what did you expect after what we had done? I mean, Dresden spawned, his grandmother was killed in the bombing of Dresden, which occasioned this. And he's been writing a poem about it every year. And it's, even in English, translated wonderfully by an Oxford professor of German, Karen Reeder, who has continued to translate him. I mean, it's more than worth reading. It's a shocking book and a harsh book, and it has extraordinary illustrations. I mean, it's just overwhelming to me.
What's
so
the title?
The German word by word, even though I don't read German.
And the title of the book is Porcelain.
Porcelain, yeah.
Porcelain.
Yeah.
Well,
Dresden, porcelain.
I want to thank you both. And I really have had, I hate to sign off, and I really just have to, because that's my job and I don't want to do it. But I want to thank both Helen and Lloyd for participating in Write America this evening, to every one of you who tuned in tonight. And thank you to Roger Rosenblatt for creating this original and important series to look forward to each and every Monday night. Tonight's episode is the perfect example of the purpose and mission of Right America. We hope to see you all next Monday at 7 as we welcome Edward Zwick and Patricia McCormick. Please remember to check out Bird's Books Right America page where you can sign up for upcoming episodes and maybe purchase a book or two. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.